So welcome to the ProWritingAid Write-In on world building. Very excited for this one. So today we're going to do two things. First, we're going to just go into some of the basics of world building for fantasy novels. We're not going to go too deep. We have a bunch of world building sessions in Fantasy Writers Week. Lisa, if you could actually also grab our world building ebook, that would be a useful tool for people in this webinar, and you can drop it in the chat. So we're going to talk through some of just the very high level basics. But as I said, the main goal of today is to start writing. So we are going to be working on writing sprints related to world building. So please have something nearby you to write with because we'll be working through that. And hi, Tony, I'm Hayley. Nice to meet you. Okay, and just another quick bit of housekeeping really quickly. If you want to share your writing, so we will be writing together. If you want to share your writing, please feel free to use the chat. I will prompt you when it's time for you to share your writing. And if you want everyone to see it, please select to send to panelists and attendees. That way everyone in the chat can see it. If it's just a panelist, then just Lisa and I can. Okay, but let's go ahead and dive in. So again, we're going to start off by just kind of talking about some of the real basics of world building. And a couple on the previous session that we had today with Janet and Demetrius, I saw a couple questions come through about world building specifically and whether it was necessary, whether it was necessary in all writing or specifically in fantasy writing. And I'm here to answer the question with an emphatic yes. World building is incredibly essential for your writing. Your characters need a place for the story to unfold. They need a setting, right? Every story needs a setting. Your story cannot happen in limbo. If you think about it as a movie or a play, if you had one of those without a set or a background, it would be really hard to follow. So the same is true for us when we're writing, when we're working on a short story, a novel, etc. It is essential to have a setting, and it is in order to make that setting make sense, it is essential to do world building. When we have a world, our characters have context. They are placed in time and space, which makes our story make sense and makes what's happening to our characters make sense as well. So the more intimately you know your world and how it affects your story, the richer and deeper your writing will be. So for those of you who are novices to world building, I want you to think about world building as a way to make your writing richer and deeper. We'll talk in a second about kind of what to include from our world building in our manuscript itself. But I want you to think about world building as part of this kind of pre-writing process that helps our story become more effective. Some of the exercises that we'll do today are things that you might just do as part of kind of your background work on your novel. They might not ever make it to your final manuscript, and that's okay. But doing this exercise and doing this world building creates this like very rich textual place for our characters to engage in. And so the more work we do on building and creating this amazing world, the more engaged our readers will be, even if some of the exercises that we go through don't make it into the story itself. So even if your world looks like your own, so for those of you who are here today who are working not on fantasy, but on something else, no matter what you're writing, it's essential to build your world for your reader. For many people, especially for science fiction and fantasy writers, world functions similar to character. Your world is almost a character in itself. It's something that your writers or that your readers will want to interact with. I want you guys to think about novels that you're currently reading, or even some of the worlds that people dropped in here previously that they really enjoyed. If you close your eyes and thinking about one of those novels, you can probably picture exactly what the neighborhood or the character's home looks like, all of that type of thing. When you have good world building in your novel, then the author has done a great job of creating this visual image that you can engage with. And that's the key of world building. We don't want our characters to be taking place in a blank white scene. We want to have this idea that if a camera were to come onto our scene, or a camera or our readers were to picture something in their mind, they would be able to picture or get close to what we were talking about. Someone in the previous chat for the previous session actually said something great, which was that one of the things they think about when world building is, will people be able to make fan art of this? And I just loved that tidbit. That's one of the things I want us to think about as we're approaching our world building prompts today. If your book is read by millions and millions of readers. Will those readers be able to create fan art of your world? Will they be able to get tattoos of your world? That type of thing. And so by creating a deep foundation with a lot of attention paid to setting and not just location, but time and objects and all of that type of stuff. By thinking through that, we create this really deep textual place for our readers to engage with, so that, practically speaking, when our novel is out there, they can draw fan art of it, or they can get tattoos of different places in our world and that type of thing. So it's essential to do this no matter what you're writing in order to create that engaging setting for our readers. So when you're world building, and this is what we're going to do in our prompts today, you want to start with the general and then go specific, okay? So we always want to start bigger and then zoom in further. And in the 3 prompts that we'll get to in just a second, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to start big and then get small. So when you're thinking about world building, I want you to start with the general. Is your story set in modern day? Are you in a particular fantasy world? Are you in a particular science fiction world? Start with these big, exactly like Marv said, these big top-down designs of these big questions. Then we can get more specific. So as I was talking about previously, when you get to your actual manuscript itself, some of the things that you do in the world building process might not make it onto the page. But even if you've thought about them in the general world, so thinking about them in terms of the background, it will provide those kind of layers of meaning that your readers will engage with. So by thinking through things like the historical context of your world, the cultural norms, all of that type of stuff, you're creating a world that feels real to your readers, even if you're not spelling every single one of those things out in your novel. So again, having some idea of what the cultural norms, what the planet looks like, what the economics, what the dress, what the languages of your world, all of that will help your world and your book feel real for readers, even if you're not talking about every single part of those things in your novel. Again, doing this work previously to writing will help you make your actual scenes more realistic. So we start with the general and then we go specific. And in one of the courses in ProWritingAid University, we kind of go into these scene by scene edits and what to include at that point. But once we start big, we want to go specific in scene by scene and then think about what's actually happening in the scene and how can we make that happen together. But let's go ahead and just practice this, because that's what the write-in is all about, is practicing specific exercises. So we're going to start general and then we're going to get more specific. So here's how it's going to work. We will have 3 sprints. I will show and explain what's happening in the first sprint, and then I'm going to start the timer for you to have an opportunity to work on this sprint. At the end of the 5 minutes, I'm going to come back on and call time. And if you would like, you can share what you've written in the chat. And then Lisa and I will go through all of the different prompts, all the different responses, give some feedback, just talk about what we wrote and that type of thing. So our first sprint, again, we're going to start general and go more specific. Our first sprint is just to think about our world. We're going to try to describe it in 50 words or less. So we want to be clear. We want to be concise, but we do want to be kind of wide reaching. So I've given us 5 minutes because it's a big task. So you might want to start down with noting down a couple of ideas about your world and then trying to synthesize that into a sentence or two that really describes what your world actually is. So that's going to be our first sprint for 5 minutes. At the end of that time, you can drop your 50-word or less description into the chat. I'm going to start the timer and I will see you in 5 minutes. About a 1-minute warning. And again, as you're dropping things into the chat, please make sure if you want everyone to see it, that it's set to panelists and attendees, just like Marv has done. All right, we are back. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you guys can see Lisa and I as we read through some of these. Lisa will be back here in a second. I always forget that the YouTubes, I can hear them, but you guys can't. So it just blared a very loud siren at me to tell us the time is up.
Alert.
We're done. So, okay, go ahead and share in the chat the worlds you're working on. Lisa and I are going to comb through them. And I just want to tell you guys a little bit about the world that I'm working on. I've been working on a YA fantasy story for some time set in the South China Seas that takes place largely on pirate sloops. So pirate sloops characters, and they are working to kind of repair a rift in the universal fabric made by an evil god. Anyway, so that's kind of mine. So let's see what we've got.
We've got more people here than we usually have, so
yes.
Forgive us if we're normally there's not quite as many to go through, which is a really great problem to have. You are all welcome.
This is amazing.
So I like this one. My world is set up in a futuristic ambiance where technology had to evolve in order to prevent a disease from expanding. That sounds timely. It's controlled by an organization that has set boundaries for only those with power and riches. The population was reduced severely, some children mutated, and now this organization is using them to take control over what remains of the world.
Ooh,
I mean, nice. I'm in. There's a lot there, isn't it?
Yeah, I love, so Ian's caught my eye as I was scrolling through. So Ian's is fantasy world where it's 23 hours of night and 3 hours of sun during 10 months of winter. It switches abruptly to summer for 3 months, and then it's 23 hours of sunlight and 3 hours of night, and only females can cast magic. And I love that. I always like to start with this prompt when world building, because it's a really great way to get us to think succinctly about our world. And there's so much that you can convey even in just 50 words or less. And Ian's reminds me of the game Don't Starve, which is one of my favorite games, which is great.
And actually, often this is where writing these things in fewer words is sometimes way harder than writing a paragraph of what your world is. And sometimes you realize that you don't have that like succinct thread that's going to run through your whole book. If you can't bring it down to 50 words, then maybe you don't have it as pinned down as you think you should.
Yes.
You want to have.
Yep. There's one here, West African, Nigeria, Lagos, the city of Lagos, the home of noise, uncertainty, and confusion, with so much of this energy engulfing every mind that comes in contact with it. This just creates such a vivid picture in my mind of what, I've never been to Lagos, but it creates a really vivid picture of the amount of activity that would be taking there, which is so great.
I think this is a great first sentence. It says, this is David, to say it was cold on the surface was an understatement. It was impossible to venture out on Europa without an environment suit. Louis always claimed taking a spacewalk was warmer. Certainly the towering ice cliffs and the deep and the 1,000-mile long crevasses made it seem colder. Ooh, I like it. I mean, I feel the chill.
This one is great. Words have power. In this world, they have all the power. They hold the key to topple the great mountain chains of the east or destroy the isle kingdoms of the west. Words shaped the world as it is today, and this is the tale of how it came to be. Like, oh, chills. These are so great. Oh man.
Earth
Read
of
a
the
couple more.
Future, this is Tammy. Earth of the Future. In a medieval-esque renaissance, its landscape forever changed by the catastrophic magical forces unleashed in the apocalypse. Magical flora and fauna bloom anew. Magical creatures, once driven to hide from humans, flourish. Witches practice magic openly, protection against the paranormal threats that lurk in the world.
Oh my gosh, so good. Here is I'm a sucker for this one. My potential story is set in modern time where people are born with the names of their soulmate tattooed on their body. In present day, it's resulted in apps and online chat rooms to specifically discuss and try to find your soulmates. In conservative societies, people are often married off immediately upon finding their soulmates without getting to know each other. As you guys who are familiar with Sarah Moss know, I am clearly a sucker for a soulmate story. So that sounds awesome. I'm also a sucker for Salem witch trials stuff, which somebody else is writing in here, which is great.
I mean, are you a sucker for dragons who are also bankers? Because that is amazing.
These
So
are
it
all so
says
good.
dragons are bankers, and unicorns with their healing powers are big pharma. Any race that resembles more human qualities are thought of as ugly, and therefore elves and creatures we typically see depicted as beautiful are ragged, poor, and have rotting teeth. They live in slums or in the sewers, which are dank and run under the city.
Ugh.
I mean, you had me at dragons are bankers.
Yeah, this is so good. All right. So Daryl asked a great question, which is, can you save the chat? Lisa and I will export the chat and we can add it as a file in the replay notes for this so that you guys can take a look at all of these because they're really so good that I wish we had time to sit here and read through all of them, but we will export it.
Back to writing. We need more writing.
Okay, more writing. Let's go to sprint number 2. Okay, so in sprint number 2, we're still focused on the general as we're moving a little bit closer to the specific. So I want us to think about the history of your world. Now, I want you to think about what happened in the past has led to the current conflict that's taking part in the kind of bounds of your novel or your story. So what set up the circumstances to have your story have its conflict? So whether that is kind of micro world building within a family, family structures that lead to it, whether that is you have a hero who is fighting a long awakened beast, whether you have a political thriller where somebody is trying to cut down a despot or whatever that is. We want to start, again, starting to get kind of more into the specific from the general. So I want you to think generally about your world and its history, and then specifically what has led it to the current conflict in your writing. This will take a little bit more time. So we have 7 minutes for this, and I am going to start the timer and we will be back soon. And no, this is not a 50 word limit. You can go over 50 in this one. Also, hey, Tanya, good to see you here. We saw last night on the networking. I'm just repeating the prompt for a couple people who have asked. So first of all, no word limit on this one. I want to think about this as kind of an overall effort, but you can get a little bit more specific within it. But the prompt is to tell the history of your world. So you want to start by explaining what has happened in the past and how that has led to whatever the current conflict that's taking place for your novel. So what historical things that might have taken place before your novel actually occurs? What has set up the situation for the conflict in your novel? I just want to add here, as we're into our latter half of this timer, that it's totally okay if your story is set on Earth or even in something like that. Our goal to this is to think of kind of what happened before our conflict starts. So it doesn't have to be a problem in another world or anything like that. It can totally be a problem on Earth or anything like that. But if we go to our opening scene, who are our characters before the opening scene? What is the world around them look like before that opening scene? Why are we focusing on them for this particular novel or story? So it doesn't have to be in a different world. It can totally be on Earth, but we want to think about what happened before the conflict, to set up the conflict that your story is going to focus on. Okay, we are back. That one was a big boom in my ears. Okay, let's go ahead. There have been some really great stories coming in. I wanted to focus on one of the ones that I just lost it. So, Lisa, if you have any that you were working on, but I wanted to. Oh, here it was on just how this kind of can work in a non-fantasy setting. So Greer has, around World War II, the U.S. Army took control of the Western Peninsula of a small Caribbean island. A quaint village occupied a portion of the lands near the coastline, lands that the Army wanted. Upon intervention by the colonial masters, the villagers were ordered to relocate elsewhere. And then we kind of move on through that about talking through how the village had remained hidden, and that type of thing. And I wanted to call attention to this one because this is a great example of how world building can and should exist in any genre, not just fantasy. So it's really important to think about the circumstances that have set up your story. So again, even if you never use these in your story itself, you having an idea of what that backstory is adds more weight and depth to your world and makes it engaging for readers. So you should always be able to answer the question kind of like what happened before this story, because that will bleed over into your writing itself. And again, that's necessary whether you're writing a romantic prompt or like a romance novel, whether you're writing historical fiction, anything like that. It's important to have an idea of like what set up the circumstances for this conflict, whatever the
Yeah,
conflict is.
well, in the session that we just had with where Demetrius was talking about how setting and experience feeds into who people are. So if you grow up in a country with a dictator, the person that you're going to become is going to be very different if that same person had been born into a more free society, or into a Republican family compared to a Democratic family. Or,
Yep.
there's just all of these things in your world, whether that's your family life world or your bigger, wider world where there's
Yep.
kings fighting over the realm. All of that is going to feed into who you've become.
Yeah. Great point. All right. Let's see what we've got.
So I like this one. Long hail the king. He was killed for believing equality between purebloods and half-breeds, but never fear, his beautiful wife and unborn heir escaped. He will return one day. We must believe that the heir will return to help us all. He's the only one that can. The new rules removed laws from perfidious that protected the rights of the half-breeds. And so all of those, that's sort of what we're talking about. You see a lot of these relationships in good fantasy about purebloods and half-breeds, and they're an allegory for things that are happening in the real world, but also they create some really excellent magical tension in your world.
Yeah, Sandra has a great one here. Humans were born with no special abilities, wanting to be equal with the special powers of 11 other races. The last queen and the last king of Idia Binto, sorry if I mispronounced that, sacrificed humanity of their firstborn so he could practice magic. But magic comes at a price. The strongest of the magi are those who kill their loved ones. So, again, this is a great example of we might not have all of that history in Sandra's specific manuscript itself, but that's setting up the kind of major conflict because it's giving this history of the races in her world, how they've interacted with each other. And I'm assuming that one of her characters will probably be one of those humans or a descendant of the king, who has this kind of whole backstory of sacrificing to practice magic.
Yeah, this is a good one. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the first couple of lines are from Lexa. It seemed a good idea to develop artificial intelligence to solve human problems, but then AI decided that humans needed changing, and as expected, humans fought back. So AI convinced humans that they won. And so they developed a society where cyborgs were created instead of computers. But that the fact that AI is convincing humans that they won, there's so much to that world just right there, and so much potential for building that all out. Love it.
This one has a great general into specific. So 100 years ago, due to a failed scientific experiment, a rip in time and space tore reality into shreds and caused people to live in their own isolated dimensions with no hope of ever meeting anyone again. There's a couple more details about it, but it says, there's basically a new chip technology. People can meet again with their loved ones, but due to a car accident, the protagonist loses his chip and is forced to grow up alone, just like the people in the past after the dimensional rip. Now, after surviving nearly 10 years on his own, he, for the first time, meets another person. So that's just such a great example of the kind of general world taking us all up into that like very first specific scene where we meet this protagonist. And even again, if we don't hear all of the other stuff spelled out, that forms the world and the conflict that protagonist will be in.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that we have time for our next sprint, we will move on to our final one.
I want to keep reading them.
I know, Lisa and I are just going to keep reading, but again, don't worry, we'll export this chat and then upload it onto the site after. So our final sprint is to get the most specific as possible and to bring this all together. So what I want you to do is to describe the opening scene of your novel, and I want you to keep in mind what we've worked on in the 2 previous sprints. So I want you to think about first the history, just as in that kind of example that I just read. What is the general history that led to this specific opening scene? Now, the other part of that, so first taking into account the general history, the next thing I want you to do is really dive deep into the description of the world in this place. And I want you to do that through your five senses. I want you to describe what your characters will see, taste, touch, smell, and hear. We'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow on the session on editing your manuscript. But when you are building setting and when you're thinking about worlds, I do not want you to just rely on sight. I want you to rely on the other four senses as well. But we're going to drive into our opening scene, and I want you to lean really, really heavily into these senses. So again, this might be wordier than your typical opening scene would be, but we're going to describe the opening scene, write the opening scene, really heavily leaning into the history that we've kind of developed, as well as these senses to describe what's going on in the world. So this will be the longest one yet. We have 10 minutes, and we will start now. We have about 5 minutes left, so keep writing. In these last few minutes, I just want you to think through, if you are nearing the end of your submission, think through what are the pieces of your world? What are the pieces that you could infuse using the five senses? So if you talked about how your world has a history of war, in your opening scene, are there remnants of that war somewhere? Are there broken windows, or are there ruins or something like that that your main character can see? If you're in a magic world, are there markings of a particular type of magic on the tree? That type of thing. Again, just thinking through what how you can add even more setting than you might have in your final manuscript, but kind of more description to hint at those pieces that we've been working at before. So if you have a finished piece and you want a few more minutes, think about what are some of the kind of over the top things that you can add to lean into hints of what we talked about previously in the previous sprints. Okay, the alarm has gone off. We are back together again. So there's some really, really great stuff coming through in the chat. And like I said, we're going to export this so that we can upload it later, so we don't lose everything. But I really loved some of the ways people are incorporating the different senses into here. I lost it, but someone was talking about the feeling of the warm sun on their skin. There's some people talking about the smell of fresh earth as well, which is just a great way, again, to make sure that we're not just incorporating sight, but to create a full world incorporating all five of those senses.
Yeah, I liked the one that says the creak of oak and pine trees, the dappled sunlight casting shadows and leaves onto the forest floor. It has recently rained, and the soaked scent of pine needles rises and mixes with the light smell of spores from the rain drop rattled toadstools. There's a slightly metallic taste on the cool breeze. I love the slightly metallic taste on the cool breeze.
Yeah,
I don't
that's
know if
great.
I've ever tasted a cool breeze that was metallic, but I feel like I understand what that means. Love
And I
that
feel
one.
like you can get, yeah, and that's, I think, the great part of worlds building is even if you haven't experienced it, you can still have an understanding of what it should be. Um, okay, let's see a couple more. Um, this one. All the smells of fresh ground after rainfall and ripe fruit, the crystalline walls and the lavish buildings, but underneath was the feeling of fear and it was infectious. Again, that kind of undercurrent. It was so great.
Isadora held her head high, one last push of bravado before opening the door and stepping out into the snarling darkness. Wispy fog billowed blindly around her, a perfect playground for the shadows that loved to scratch and snatch.
Ugh, love it. Beyond the garden, a jazz band played, their brash rhythms juxtaposed with the steady droning of automobile tires rolling along North Charles Street. Students lazily strolled by in the late afternoon sun, the breeze bringing the floral scent of late spring. A rider of a weather-beaten bicycle propped against a stone wall momentarily caught Elizabeth's eye. These are so great. You guys are so great. Such great
So
books.
what I think would be cool is if we take this and get all of these examples, because I feel like tonight we've got way more than we
Yep.
can actually cope with, and there's so much here that I really want to pick out and push. So if we put these all into um, a post in our Facebook group, is that the best place for people to do it? Then I'd
Yep.
love for you to give feedback to each other, and let's make this a um, there's no need for it just to be Hayley and me. You guys are all writers. You know what you're wanting to write. You probably have a lot more to offer in some of these genres than we do. So, um, yeah, let's work together and share our ideas.
Yeah, so a couple things just as we close today. So first, we will share these in the Fantasy Writers Facebook group. We can also put them in potentially the just regular Pro Writing Aid Facebook group as well, because I know some of you guys are just here. Lisa's going to drop the links here shortly. If you don't do Facebook, we can tweet some of these links out as well. No worries. So first of all, we really want to, the kind of goal of the write-in and why we initially started doing these is just to get you writing. And I think that is something that I struggle with, is just making the time to start writing and then also to connect with other writers. And this is really kind of the ethos of why we didn't just create a course with Pro Writing Aid University, but why we are creating the community part of it as well. Moving into next month, moving into March, we will be doing daily challenges like these, where you will be writing on a specific prompt. It's actually, a lot of them are related to world building, and then we'll be getting feedback and doing them and working through feedback together. So if any of you want to join us, that's kind of this type of activity is what we will be doing every single day in Pro Writing Aid University. And then also coming together for workshops where we'll be in a little bit of a smaller crew and have more time to kind of dig into specific areas of your writing. We'll still be doing these write-ins for free as well too. So if you if you don't want to join us for whatever reason, totally fine. And we will be here same time, same place next month. But if this is this kind of more close community and more in-depth feedback is something you're interested in, again, we'll drop the links a couple more times in the chat and we'd be happy to have you join us.
Yeah, well, and I just think the accountability side of things, the having
Yeah.
somebody who's saying, "Did you do yours today? What did you think of this assignment? What did you think of this bit where you had to write your timeline? What did you think of this?" And feeding back is really powerful. So if you're trying to build a new writing habit for the year, this is this is a good way to start yourself off. And with
Awesome.
that, we're signed off. So there's one more networking event today, right, Hayley?
So there is one more networking event. If you are here as part of Fantasy Writers Week, we have a networking event in a couple hours at 5 p.m. where we will be building the ultimate fantasy reading list. So if you want to join us for that, we will be working in small groups to kind of get to meet other writers and just talk about books that you love. So please feel free to join us for that. It's 5 p.m. Eastern time. The link should be in your email, and then we'll also be sharing it in the Facebook group as well. So we will see you there, everyone. And thank you guys so much for sharing your wonderful writing with us. Let me just save the chat before I forget.
And for those of you who are looking for the link, if you've joined the Fantasy Writers Week group, it's on Facebook. Pop over there and we'll drop the link in there before the event tonight. It'll also be in your email that you would have had when you first signed up. Great. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
See everybody
Bye.
soon.